Welcome back, everyone. There are many things that do not mix with Islamic ideology, things like freedom and equality. Even a passing familiarity with Islamic religious and legal texts reveals severe curtailing of human rights and dignity, complete with a veritable boat anchor, sure to keep entire cultures firmly moored in the past, slow or unable to progress and improve. What's more is that all of this comes with the presupposition that the whole earth belongs to Allah and His Messenger. Therefore, subjugation of non-Muslims who are unfortunate enough to live in Islamic lands and conquest everywhere else are seen as validation of Islam's truthfulness and superiority. In this sense, Islam lacks a transcendent framework. It's a very earthy, nearsighted, materialistic religion, constantly seeking superficial validation. It's important to understand these things, especially when we consider that Islam, by default, is at war with the West. The two are fundamentally opposed. However, presently, hostile Muslim nations are so incredibly weak compared to, say, the United States, that an old-school Islamic jihad-style invasion simply isn't an option. So, Islamists concoct other strategies to undermine the West from within. Unfortunately, many in the West have situated themselves perfectly for these attacks. Catherine Shackdam is well known as a Jewish woman who unfortunately married into Islam. She became a journalist who played the part well enough to interview some of the highest-ranking Iranian officials. As you will have guessed by now, Catherine was not who she seemed. Obviously, she kept her Jewish identity concealed, but she was treated very poorly in her marriage, not to mention the way that women are treated in an Islamic culture more broadly. But she wanted to get closer to the Islamic Republic because she began noticing Iran's increasing disruption where she was living at the time in Yemen. That's where her journalism started. Here's her description of how the Iranian regime infiltrated Yemen.
So Yemen, as far as an Islamic society can be called tolerant, was actually quite tolerant of the different school of thoughts from within. And they didn't really care. But the regime in Iran made sure that that changed. And people began to think themselves in terms of little boxes. When they start to put labels on people, when you start doing that, a society starts to break. And what I witnessed is something that they replicated over and over again. And I think that Yemen is the last, I would say, episode of that, the regime's play, in that what they do, they don't break into your country immediately, in that they can't necessarily invade you, not all the time. But what they do, they look for this one minority, this one community they could build a bridge with and acquire to their ideology, to then use those people, they become proxies, to then sip their poison into society and divide society up by creating victimhood.
The parallels we currently see as Islamists attempt to further infiltrate the West are obvious.
So the regime did this. So first they breach a country, then they start to poison you and separate you into communities that would then be taught to hate one another. They isolate, the Christian from the Jews and the others. They start spreading lies, making a brother hate on his brother or tell on his brother, and people end up in prison. Then they break into families where women are becoming subject of, basically you become a slave. Women lose their voice. If a woman loses their voice, women tend to raise families. And so if a woman loses her voice, then you have a problem for society, because society becomes dumb and deaf and mute. Case in point, Iran. And then what they do is they move on to the next one and expand, and they bully you, and they weaponize victimhood. So the whole series of tools and techniques that they use, and that they're using today here in the UK.
How did the Islamic Republic seep its poison into Yemen? First, divide people into their own little boxes. Second, pick a minority and convert them into a proxy. Overall, it's a weaponization of victimhood, something many Westerners have become absolutely obsessed with, and Islamists know it. And that's where Catherine became a putative tool for the Iranian regime.
Now, back then, the architect of Iran, the regime's propaganda machine, Nader Talebzadeh, the man who let me in the regime, was in charge of recruiting people like me that he felt would fit the purpose that they had, which was to train new mouthpiece for the regime to crack the West and to translate the violence that the regime was doing in the Middle East in a way that could relate to a Western audience hungry for victimhood.
As I said earlier, many in the West have situated themselves perfectly for this style of Islamic infiltration. The latest trends of the noisiest activists are animated by an insatiable appetite to group people by the shallowest of characteristics, divide society, and then figure out in which box of the hierarchy of oppression they belong. And heaven help those who aren't lucky enough to belong in one at all. And in this worldview, as stupid as it is suicidal, even the most extreme ideologies, like radical Islam, full-out jihadists, they're given the victim label and cheered for. Westerners welcome in and label as oppressed the very same people who exploit the victimhood narrative to undermine the West. Westerners become proxies for their own demise. And they're taught to be so overcome with their own sense of guilt that they welcome it. So what's the fix? First, recognize the Islamist strategy. It's so incredibly obvious that it hardly needs to be pointed out in a video. But this is one of several where I've done just that. Second, and this is hard for guilt-addicted Westerners, recognize that all ways of living are not equal, and Islamic values are demonstrably inferior. Western activists face a supply and demand problem. Their demand for objects of oppression far exceeds the supply. Not so in the Islamic world, should they happen to notice this. Hot topics like racism, slavery, oppression of various people groups are all still things very much a reality in Muslim nations. However, to notice this is to blame the victims, ironically. Currently, Westerners are doing well enough, for the most part, to engage in this delusionary cycle of luxury beliefs, but why anyone would want to, I have no idea. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.